well, welcome everybody. This is a presentation on spring mushroom hunting in the Sacramento region, hosted by the Sacramento Public Library and the Sacramento Area Mushroomers. Just to start out, this is a pair of photos of a bird's nest fungi. So these are a special type of fungus that show up usually on kind of wood chips or rotting logs. And they start out with a little cover on them, and then when the conditions are right, this cover opens up and you can see these little eggs inside the nest. These are little 1/4 inch wide little nests here. So these little eggs are actually agglomerations of hundreds of thousands of little spores, and the spores are what the mushroom uses to propagate itself. So the rain comes down and drops into this cup and launches out these little spores so that they spread around and can start new little bird's nest fungi in those new areas. All right, cool. So my name is Jim Adams. I've been mushroom hunting for over 20 years now. I grew up in the northern San Francisco Bay Area and have been a member of the Mycological Society pretty much everywhere I've lived. So the Mycological Society of San Francisco, the Fungus Federation of Santa Cruz, the Los Angeles Mycological Society. Los Angeles is kind of a sad place to be a mushroom hunter, unfortunately. But they do have mushrooms down there. There are some natural areas that you can go to. You can take a drive for an hour or two into the national forests during the right time of year and find some mushrooms. So, been the president of the Sacramento Area Mushroomers for a few years now, and it's a little sacrilegious in mushroom circles, but I actually don't like eating mushrooms. I will enjoy finding them. I really enjoy photography, but I will often give my mushrooms, the edible ones that I find, to friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, things like that. I did want to warn that you all really shouldn't be using this presentation as a basis to go forage and eat any mushrooms. You really should be going out with experts and locals who can show you the exact conditions, the exact version of the mushroom that you're looking for, so that you can positively identify your finds in the future. These presentations are helpful to get you started, but shouldn't be the thing you use to start eating something. Just a quick overview, we'll kind of go over some key interesting mushrooms, some beautiful mushrooms, where to go on a mushroom hunt for the spring, when to go, and some additional resources if you want to learn more. So I think one of the most choice edibles that you're going to find in the spring for mushroom hunting are these spring king mushrooms, Boletus rex veris. So this is a bolete, which is a special family of mushrooms that have a different type of spore-bearing surface. So if you think of a regular mushroom, they have those gills that are kind of like the pages of a book. When you open the book, you're like, oh, look at all those flat lines that are underneath the cap of the mushroom. These boletes actually have more like a sponge structure. There's a bunch of really tiny holes that the spores fall out of, which is a different surface for the spores to come out of the mushroom. They're a relatively safe variety of mushroom to find. When you find mushrooms with these sponge-like gills, there's not too many that are poisonous that you might kind of hurt yourself with. The ones you might want to avoid are ones that turn blue or they stain blue when you cut them in half. There are a couple of those that are edible, but there are a couple that are kind of upset stomach causing. You're not going to die from eating these kinds of boletes, but they're not going to leave you very happy that you decided to eat them. But so these ones that don't turn colors when you cut into them, but they have this gill structure, they're growing under pines, they're relatively safe mushrooms to go out and forage. It is different from the porcini that you're going to see in the fall. So they look very similar. The porcinis are a little bit lighter in coloring. They are both just choice mushrooms. They have great texture and flavor. The porcini is a little bit more dense, a little bit harder, so you got to cook it a little bit more. But they're both really, really delectable mushrooms. It's just, even though they look very similar, they're different species and they come up at two very different times of the year. These mushrooms are gonna form underneath the pine, fir, and hemlock forests that we have up in the mountains to the east. So these are kind of looking roughly 3,000 feet of elevation and above, maybe 2,500 depending on the area. Sometimes there's a little hump of these needles covering the mushroom, and that's all you'll see is just a little mushroom hump, or a shrump is how we like to call them. And so what you can do when you're going out in the forest is you see these little raised areas, you can kind of move over those leaves and see if there might be a mushroom hiding underneath. It's always helpful to put them back if there's no mushroom there to kind of maintain the integrity of the environment that you're in. But you're going to be looking for wet areas because these mushrooms are going to come up after the snow melts, maybe 2 to 3 to 4 weeks after that snow melts. So they need to have moisture that entire time that they're developing. So you're looking for wetter areas, maybe areas where the snow piled up in the winter, and so it's a little bit wetter when you go out. Areas where there's maybe like a drainage, where there's a creek that's dry in certain parts of the year, but maintains that moisture that can maintain these mushrooms. You can also look around campgrounds. There's also usually really good drainage around campgrounds, and so that would be a really good area to check out. Those photos are courtesy of Matt Miller. He's one of our members who's our Spring King expert. He seems to go out and find like dozens every year, and he's kind of the envy of the group. I have actually never found one of these out in the wild. So I'm hoping I can convince him to maybe one day lead our group out to go find some, because these are really great edibles, and sometimes they're really, really big. I mean, this thing's bigger than the size of like a dinner plate. So you do want to watch out. They can get eaten by other things. These are really good mushrooms, and everybody else agrees, including the deer and the bugs and the slugs. So you're hoping to find them fresh when there's less kind of bug infestations in them. When you cut them off the ground, you're cutting the base of the stalk, you'll usually be able to see whether the bugs have kind of bored their way into the central part of the mushroom. Generally, you're not going to want to eat those unless you want a little extra protein with your mushrooms. So that's kind of our spring bolete discussion. And now for some very pretty mushrooms. So this is a Chromocera cyanophylla. It grows underneath the bark of conifer logs. So what'll happen is you kind of see a little bit of mauve coming out from a split in a log, and then you open it up, and there's all these mushrooms growing underneath it. I will note that these photos are courtesy of Michael Wood, who is a really prolific mushroom photographer, and I really appreciate that they were able to post some of the stuff up online that I was able to use. Another really cool mushroom that grows up in the Sierra in the spring is Mitrula elegans. This is also called a matchstick fungus because it kind of looks like a matchstick with the yellow head instead of a red head that we're used to in our matches. It's an ascomycete. An ascomycete is a type of mushroom that instead of having gills, it produces spores on the surface of the mushroom. So it's kind of got a little bit of a different structure than either the boletes or the regular mushrooms that you might see. These really like very moist areas, so they'll grow like on the edge of marshes and bogs and things like that up in the Sierras. This pine cone was actually in the bog, and so when they pulled it out, they found that these mushrooms were growing right onto that. Nothing edible in these cool mushrooms, unfortunately, but they are kind of pretty. This Cutanelia clavis looks like a regular mushroom from up top. Looks like it might have gills, but then when you look at the bottom, you can see it's an ascomycete, so it's just bearing spores all over this structure. They grow on the rotting grasses in the meadows and around bogs. So what'll happen is the grass from last year has died over the summer, and then it gets all wet over the winter and kind of breaks down even more, and then these mushrooms come in the spring once the snow melts and start breaking it down even more. So at the base of these mushrooms, you're always going to find little stalks of dead grasses. On the left is Dondania nigrella, which is another ascomycete that is a cup fungus. So you can see it kind of has a cup-like structure, but it's a stalked cup fungus, which is a little bit more rare. Just a beautiful little black mushroom growing either on dead wood on the ground or on these rotting needles of pine trees. The Heterotextus alpinus is a really pretty mushroom. They're very gelatinous or jelly-like, and I don't know, I like calling them lemon drops because they look like little lemon drops. Again, not anything particularly edible. I don't think they're poisonous or anything, but they're so tiny that they wouldn't really do much to a dish that you added them to. This Mycena nivicola I found pretty spectacular because it comes literally as the snow is melting. In some cases it encourages the melting, so it kind of creates these little spaces and holes as they're growing up through the snow. So little teeny tiny mushrooms. Mycenas are well known for being little small mushrooms, but they are quite amazing, and they have like little furry legs down here at the bottom. So now I'm going to talk a bit about fire-adapted fungi. So there's different names for these, like pyrophilus or charcoal-loving, but they're just generally associated with environments that have experienced fires. Fires provide a different type of habitat for mushrooms. They provide different chemicals in the soil, different nutrients, different minerals, and so there's specific mushrooms that seek out those types of habitats out in the wild. And so on the left and in the center here, there's Geopyxis carbonaria. This is a really good mushroom to use as a identifier for whether you're in the habitat that morel mushrooms also will like and will fruit in. So when you see these Geopyxis, you're gonna kind of slow down and look for some morels because they tend to have the same habitat and they come out about the same time of the year. So the British are really fun with naming mushrooms. So like they call it the charcoal-loving elf cup, or the dwarf acorn cup, or the stalked bonfire cup. I really enjoy how the British have really alliterative names, common names for their mushrooms. And here in North America, we tend to use much more Latin names. Do you have a question?
I think I've seen those cup mushrooms like in my yard.
Oh yeah?
Like, cause I have a sand pit and I saw some like cup mushrooms, the exact same color growing on them.
Nice.
I think I saw some of those in my yard.
Interesting, yeah, you know, mushrooms can appear in the strangest areas, like we wouldn't expect them. You know, your yard probably isn't up in the mountains, in a forest, but it still has some of these same fungi. So maybe one of the little spores made its way into the property. Very cool. Similarly, this Anthrophobia melanoma are these little tiny orange little spot fungus that'll come up in these burned areas. Also a good indicator that you're in a good habitat for morel mushrooms. The Alluria aurantia, orange peel fungus. Orange peel fungus is a lot easier to say. And it's a type of Pisiza. Just, you know, these little fun orange mushrooms that grow on burned ground. Just pretty and good indicators that you're in an area where there might be some morels. Probably the most spectacular, I think, of these fire-adapted fungi is the Sarcosphaera coronaria. It's a mauve purple mushroom that's really hard for the camera to pick up, but they'll grow just barely underground, and when they open up at the top of the structure that this mushroom has, that's flush with the top of the ground. So they're like these little couple holes in the ground all over, and again, a good indicator that you're in the right habitat for some morel mushrooms. They're really, I really wish I could get a better picture of the mauve color of these, because like when you're out in the forest and everything's like black and tan, because of either the dead pine needles or the kind of carbonated, burned material, all of a sudden this like beautiful light purple hole shows up, and you're like, wow. So now we're gonna kind of get into some of the morel discussion. Can anybody guess how many morel mushrooms are in this photo? Close. So there are 5. So we have this guy right here. We have that one right here. There are several back in here, and then another couple back over here. Those ones are a little bit harder to see, but this one here and this one down here are kind of the easiest ones to see. These things hide like crazy, and they're absolutely infuriating to try and hunt sometimes. How many do you think are in this one? I had 4 when I counted. So we got one really obvious one down here. We got another slightly obvious one over here. And then there are actually a couple down under the leaf litter here. This bush, which I'm not entirely familiar with what species this is, but I like finding these bushes in the formerly burned areas because there are often many, many morels hanging out underneath. They do have some thorns to them sometimes though, so watch how quickly you're just grabbing in there to get the morels, because yeah, it can be a little rough. So why am I focused on these burned areas? Well, you know, you can get enough morels for like a meal after hunting for a full day out in the forest that hasn't been burned. You can find them, you can get enough to satisfy yourself. But if you go out to these formerly burned areas, you're gonna find 5 to 10 times as many. And so you can get enough for several meals over the course of a couple hours, which is a lot easier on your back. But it's important to think about safety in these burned areas. So if you think about places like where the Caldor fire went through outside of Pollock Pines last year, there's a lot of dangerous trees out there that are unstable because the fire has come through. They maybe have burned out the roots, they've caused some weakness in the tree, maybe they end up getting infected by bark beetles the next year because they're a little bit more sensitive. So you want to be very aware of what's going on around you when you're out in the forest. So you're going to be looking for trees that might fall. If it's really windy, I'd say maybe more than 20-mile-per-hour winds, don't go out into the forest where there's a bunch of dead and dying trees. They will fall on you, and I mean, maybe someone will hear you scream, but it depends on if you went out with anybody. So, you know, you're gonna wanna look up regularly, pay attention to what's going on around you. You're gonna be so focused on the ground and looking for mushrooms, but this is just a reminder to kind of look up every once in a while, see what's going on around you, make sure you're not getting yourself into a part of the forest that's more dangerous than where you started. It's also helpful to stay on your feet. So if you're going around and you find a set of morels, instead of kind of sitting on the ground and slowly picking them, it's helpful to stay on your feet while you're cutting them. I mean, that extra 10 seconds of getting onto your feet could be the difference between diving out of the way of the top of a tree, falling down, and getting hit. So it's also important to think about kind of where you're stepping. What will happen is when these fires come through, they burn into the roots of the trees, and so those roots go pretty deep, and sometimes they can be really thick. And when those are gone, that then creates a void in the earth. And so if you're stepping around a tree that's been burned out, it's really important to step lightly because you could go all the way through and twist your ankle pretty hard, and then you're out in maybe the middle of nowhere with a really injured foot. So. You know, it's always important to be prepared and communicate when you're going to the outdoors, especially if you're going alone. I highly recommend against going mushroom hunting alone. It's much easier to get lost when you're mushroom hunting because you kind of lose track of some of those key orienting features of the forest. It's helpful if you can be in cell phone service. You know, there's a lot of places now out in the National Forest where you still get at least a little bit of service in case you have an emergency. And you know, tell somebody where you're going if you do go alone so that they know where to send the search party if you don't come back. Alright, so as I talked about, they really like to hide. They blend in with their surroundings. So one of the things I like to remind people is that it's really helpful to get your mushroom eyes on. Mushroom eyes, what are mushroom eyes? So our eyes are very used to these surfaces around us that are very flat, sharp edges, matted colors, very light. These are human-made environments that we're in most of the time. When we go out into nature, there's none of that. And so our eyes aren't really used to being able to detect the patterns and the differences in these natural areas the way we are when we're here inside a building. So, you know, when you are going out, it's helpful, particularly when you find your first mushroom, to just kind of stop what you're doing. Get your eyes used to what the pattern of this mushroom looks like in contrast to the things that are around it. And that'll help your eyes get used to trying to detect these in a rather chaotic environment. It can also be helpful to stop when you find these mushrooms because they often grow in groups. So I found sometimes when I get a little too excited and I go to try and pick this mushroom, that as I stepped over to pick it, I stepped on like 2 other beautiful morels and ruined them. So it's always helpful to just stop, look around, maybe get close to the ground, and see if you can find other of these morels in that same area. You know, that's my little knife here. It's really helpful with these morels to cut them off at the base because they will bring up lots of dirt and sand and charcoal and other grossness that you don't necessarily want to be eating with your meal. Further, when you leave the base of the mushroom in the ground, you're actually leaving the nutrients to recycle. You're causing less damage to the mycelium, which is the kind of living organism that's producing that mushroom. So you know, just be gentle with your mushrooms out here. We had talked a bit about those ascomycetes, those mushrooms that have the spore-bearing structures on the outside. Morels are in that classification as well, and so that's kind of why they grow in those same areas as some of the other ascomycetes. You know, if you can come out on one of our morel hunts in the spring, I highly encourage you to do so. Usually our first weekend is the most popular. We actually had double this number of people on this trip eventually by the midday. So, you know, we'll go out for 3 weekends in a row in the spring when the timing is right. And so, I mean, my personal tip is come on the last weekend because we'll have had 2 weekends of experience figuring out where the mushrooms are and what the right habitat is. But sometimes that first week is a little chaotic, so. But excellent way to learn what you're doing and to go out with some experts. We have several members who are really well versed in doing these hunts at this point, so we can kind of split up a little bit more and have some more success. One of the things you'll find is that up in the mountains in the springtime when the snow's melting, you'll also find some wildflowers. Usually if you're finding lots of wildflowers, you're too low in elevation, you need to go further up if you're looking for morels specifically. So on the left here is a wallflower, and then these are forget-me-nots. Sometimes you'll see a couple of little first wallflower flowers of the year when you're finding morels, but more often when there's this many flowers on them, and particularly when the forget-me-nots are flowering, that is past the time that morels will be coming out. So when you're out in the forest and you're not finding the morels, the recommendation is to change your elevation rather than change your location like on the mountain. So like instead of going from the north side of the mountain to the south side of the mountain, you're gonna wanna go up the mountain. And that'll provide you a better opportunity of finding more morel mushrooms because the way the season works is it kind of slowly progresses up the hill as it gets warmer and as the snow melts. But you can have a really successful, like actually this was half of what I had collected that day. I gave the other half to a member who was having a bit harder of a time finding the mushrooms. But you can get a lot in just a few hours in the right habitat. Excuse me. And you know, once you know what you're looking for and when they're coming up, it can be relatively easy to find these. But it took me 7 years before I found my first morel, of going out every year and trying to find them. Now that we have these fire scars that are so close to the Sacramento area, the learning curve is much shorter. There's much more of these mushrooms out than there used to be, so hopefully you don't have to wait 7 years for your first morel. Yeah.
Are there any mushrooms you want to avoid?
Yes, and actually you are so prescient because we are going to talk about false morels now. So these are not morels. I don't know if you all have been paying attention to the pictures of the morel mushrooms, but they are a very distinct mushroom, and these, to me, don't look anything like them. So for example, this Gyromita esculenta is kind of the classic false morel, but it doesn't have the pitting in the cap the way that a real morel does. It doesn't have the right color. It does have a hollow stem, which morels have hollow stems, but you know, if you see this, don't eat it. It's not a morel. I don't know how else to communicate the concern. Gyromitas do produce a pretty intense gastrointestinal upset, so it's not going to kill you, but you might wish you were dead because it's really awful for a few days. This is a Gyromita californica. Also has a darker cap here, but again, it's lacking all those pits. So it's similar, but it's not the same thing. And then finally, this Gyromita infula is a kind of like an elfin saddle, like a little elf would use this saddle to ride a horse, a little miniature horse out in the forest. And sometimes they're a little bit more mauve and old. But again, these are not morel. Don't eat these. They're not morels. So when are you going to go to find morels? Well, you're going to go in the spring after the snow melts. So morels come up after the snow has melted in an area, usually a week or 2 weeks after that snow has melted. Often there's still snow that's present in the shade in the areas that you're looking for. So for example, here, this snowbank is about a half mile away from where I'm standing, and I found at least 50 morel mushrooms in this one little area. So you want to be in areas where you can still see the snow. Like, maybe it's not right where you are, but you can see it's nearby enough to have recently melted from where you are. Similarly, like, this is an area where we found a lot of good morels, not right next to the snow, but this was mostly in areas that were getting a lot of afternoon shade. So as I mentioned, you're going to kind of work your way uphill. The morels show up between 2,500, 3,000 feet, all the way up to 9,000 feet and above, and it really just follows that melting of the snow. And so that can happen anytime between March and May. It really depends on what the snowpack was that year. In a year like now, where it's average to middling, I would expect us to be going out in early May to start looking for these. But it really depends on what happens with storms here in March, and if it re-blankets these areas with a new foot or two of snow, then that puts us off more towards the end of May. The fruiting can occur in waves, often in response to the heat spells that we'll have. So if we have a set of fruiting at like 3,000 feet, and then there's like a warm spell in the valley where it's in the upper 80s for a few days, the fruiting area will jump 1,500 feet. So instead of at 3,500 feet, they're now fruiting at 5,000 feet. And the physical distance between 3,000 and 5,000 feet is like 10 miles. So you could be really far away from where the mushrooms are coming just based on a little bit of change in the weather. So you want to kind of keep an eye out for how much heat's been happening and where the snow is melting. Well, how do you know where the snow is melting? I mean, I don't live in the mountains, and I assume that many of you do not live in the mountains. I mean, we can see from down here in the valley sometimes the snow-capped peaks. But if you really want to know where the snow is at any point in time, I highly recommend the California-Nevada River Forecast Center. The website's down here. And it's basically a map that shows all the river levels. And so that's this rivers, reservoirs. What you would do is you would uncheck that kind of checkbox that shows up when you first open up the website. And you would go down here to the Norsk, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's an acronym for the snow survey people. And so you check this one, and you can, for example, check the snow depth on a specific day, preferably a recent one close to when you want to go out. And it'll pop up with all these little stations, and it'll tell you how much snow is at that station. And so when you click on those little station indicators, it'll identify what the elevation is for that marker and where its location is. So say you're looking to go mushroom hunting in this area. Well, there aren't any of these little stations in this area, but there is one to the north and there's one to the south. So you can kind of use these two to judge where the snow's melting in the area at that same elevation in between the two, right? So that's how you find out where the snow's melting. And again, you're wanting to go up to the place where the snow melted about a week or 2 weeks ago. And then fire scars. So fire is really the key to having a really successful morel day. If you look up California historical fire perimeters on Google, the first link that comes up is a statewide geographic information system based map, so like a GIS map, that will have the outlines of all of the fires that have happened in California, particularly in the mountains, over the last 5, 10, whatever period you want to look at. And so you can use that tool to identify where were there fires recently that I might want to go back to find the morels. You're going to want to wait until there's been a season of snow in that area, in that fire scar, before you go look for the morels. So for example, if there's a fire in August, you're going to want to wait until the next April or May before you look for the mushrooms that are coming out in response to that fire. They'll continue to come out for up to 3, 5, 10 years after that fire. So we're still hunting in the Caldor fire scar, and I think we're now at like 6 years after the fire. And they're still coming up in good enough numbers to be worth taking a group out there. That first year after the fire, they go like gangbusters. Like they're really everywhere, depending on getting the right location and conditions. So you know, it's fun to go out to these areas, but also a little bit dangerous, as we talked about earlier. So what you're seeing here on the right is a burned area emergency response report. They also call them BAER reports, B-A-E-R. This is one for the King Fire, which was back in 2014. It was an area we did previously go and hunt for. It's kind of between Highway 50 and Interstate 80. It's kind of petered out in the last few years, so we don't, and the Caldor Fire is much easier to access, so we haven't been going up there quite as much. But what this provides is a little bit of an indicator of how intense the fire was in these different areas. And you're going to want to avoid these areas that have the dark red. This is an area where the fire was so intense, it burned all of the soil, and really all that's left is the minerals and the rocks at the base of a bunch of very dead trees. Morels don't like those habitats in the long term. You might find some in that first year after the fire, particularly if you find those areas where the roots got burned out. Sometimes you'll find hundreds of morels in that kind of area where the tree used to be. But if you're going out a year or two after the fire, these are really not areas you're going to find many morels. For example, these areas here that have been denuded of trees, both because the fire was so intense and then the Forest Service allows logging after the fires and they often clear cut the area, there's nothing alive here. I mean, you know, there's a little bit of green, but there's really not a lot living in the soil. There's not a lot of nutrients to fuel the morel mushrooms for more than that first year after the fire. So I would say don't waste your time trying to find mushrooms in these areas. There's just not enough life. This is where you want to hunt. So you can see the fire has gone through here. It burned a lot of stuff. It did kill some of the trees, but you also have a lot of living trees in the area. And so I've had the most success with finding morel mushrooms in these partially burned habitats. So the trees have dropped some leaves on the ground since the fire, so it's kind of regenerating that layer of duff that the fungus lives in. So that's kind of, this is what you're looking for, this kind of habitat. Maybe a little bit more cleared out even, but this is what you're looking for. Now, where are you gonna go? So mostly the national forests up in the mountains. Again, we're talking about that 2,500, 3,000 foot up to 9,000 feet elevation, and you're not going to find that here in Elk Grove, but it's a short hour-and-a-half drive up Highway 50 to get to some of our national forests. But if you want to go a little bit further north, the Plumas National Forest is absolutely fantastic for all kinds of mushroom hunting, including morels. They had the Dixie Fire a couple of years ago, which was a very big fire. It marred a lot of this really beautiful forest land, unfortunately. But it also created a lot of habitat for these fire-loving fungi. So, you know, the Oro-Quincy Highway, the Quincy-LaPorte Road, again, looking for those areas that didn't have really intense burns. It's a little bit further than we tend to go, just because it's a couple hours to get up there, but definitely a great for a weekend trip if you want to go up. The Lassen National Forest also allows collecting. You can collect up to 5 pounds of morels, or those king boletes that we talked about at the beginning. The Shasta Trinity National Forest is a little bit more militant about things. They have a lot of pressure from commercial hunters that come up from Washington and Oregon during the spring, and so they'll limit you to a gallon of mushrooms per year. Mendocino National Forest, similarly, really hunted by a lot of commercial hunters, more so than further north because it's a little bit closer to the population centers of the Bay Area. But the Tahoe National Forest is just outside our front door here on Highway 80, and so they're a little ambiguous on what their personal collection limits are. If you go online, you're not going to find a lot of information, but I think you're pretty safe if you go with that 1 gallon limit, and you know, that's 4 quarts, 16 cups of, that's a lot of mushrooms for you for a year. And you know, I don't find a lot of rangers when I go out on the weekends. You might find them when you go out during the week. But you know, the rules are in place to try and protect the resource, to not over-extract mushrooms from the environment. So you want to kind of be judicious. Maybe when you find a patch of mushrooms, you leave a third of them to continue the propagation process of nature. Some places that are specific. So if you go up Highway 20, and then go up to the Bowman Lakes area, maybe go up Highway 89 and check out Jackson Meadows from the backside. Those would be a little bit more late season, so more into June when the snow's melting at the elevation. But those are great areas to explore. There hasn't been a lot of fire, so maybe not so much for the morels, but they would be great for finding those boletes. And then further south, this French Meadows Reservoir area, kind of outside of Forest Hill, this would also be another good place to look for mushrooms. There's been a couple of fires here in the Middle Fork of the American River over the last few years. The elevations are a little low for morels, but it might be worthwhile going out there to explore. And then towards the south, we have the El Dorado National Forest, the Stanislaus, and the Sierra. The Sierra National Forest is a ways away. I mean, it's south of Merced, so we tend to not go out there too much, but it would be a good place to explore as well. El Dorado is the forest for morel hunting over the past 5-6 years. Ever since the Caldor fire came through, it basically burned from Pollock Pines all the way up to Silver Lake and Caples Lake. So this whole area is now prime habitat for finding these morel mushrooms. This is Mormon Emigrant Trail, is the road. It connects Highway 50 with Highway 88. Oh yeah.
Other than morels, are there some like really interesting mushrooms we should be able to find in like some really close places?
Yeah, so a little bit closer, like here to Elk Grove, what you would be looking for would be mushrooms that come up under oak trees in the fall. So you're thinking more like November, December, and you're looking for areas that have those old native oaks. One of the challenges we have here in the Central Valley is that so much of the soil has been plowed under or mined through that the ecological basis of that soil is just gone. And so that fungal diversity went away hundreds of years ago, unfortunately. But there are some parks that we have that you can go to and try and explore and find some local mushrooms as well. And then, you find the ones in your yard and some of those other close areas as well. Good question. Okay, so a little bit more on Stumpy Meadows. This is Wentworth Springs Road that comes out of Georgetown. We used to go out here quite a bit to find the naturally occurring morels, and you can still find them on the north side of the lake. But there was a pretty intense fire that came through this part of the forest, and really, after the logging operations, has kind of decimated the habitat there. Ice House Reservoir, Union Valley Reservoir, kind of going up towards the Rubicon. This is kind of the south way to get to those French Meadows Reservoir that I was talking about a little bit earlier. These are all really great areas to look for both the morels and the spring king boletes. All right, so in the El Dorado National Forest, they have a similar incidental use collecting limit, so you get a gallon of mushrooms per year. They do also provide permits for collecting larger amounts. So for $20, you can collect up to 40 pounds of mushrooms. And so that is a pretty good deal, considering when you go to the store, morels are usually between $60 and $120 a pound. You can find those permits at any of the Forest Service stations. There's, I think, a few of them are, so the Forest Service office locations. So down in Pioneer, Camino, Pollock Pines, Georgetown, those are places you can stop. There are kind of long lines sometimes, particularly on the weekends. So plan ahead if you need a permit. A little further south is the Stanislaus National Forest. So this is a little bit further away. It takes about 2 hours to get to most parts of the forest. And they've had less impact from fire. So there's been fewer wildfires down here in the Stanislaus than there have been in El Dorado or other areas further north. Not entirely sure why they're so lucky. I think part of it is there's fewer people in this forest than in the other ones, just because of where it's located in the state and in relation to population centers. But you're gonna find a lot of really beautiful mushrooms along Highway 108 and along Highway 4. There's a lot of really special places like Calaveras Big Trees State Park. Calaveras Big Trees is a fantastic place to go mushroom hunting. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to pick or take anything home from state parks. So it's more of an observation or photography destination for mushroom hunting than picking a bunch of morels to take home and cook. But if you just go up the highway a little bit further up into like Bear Valley, up to Lake Alpine, those are all plenty of areas where you can go and collect. The same collecting limits as the El Dorado, so about a gallon per year. Yeah.
How do you cook morels?
Cooking morels is a relatively straightforward process. You're gonna wanna cook them in a little bit of fat, or you can dry cook them, but you don't wanna cook them in any kind of water or sauce that they will then absorb and kind of disintegrate all of their texture and flavor. So light, often people will cook them with like peas and asparagus with some pasta or with some fish. I've seen people cook them a little bit more robustly in like a steak sauce. So you cook the mushroom with the fat or dry, and then you add your sauces, then you add your liquids to it, and it'll add that flavor, but you don't want to kind of braise a mushroom. Was that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then if you go up Highway 108, Pinecrest is a really great area to do some exploring, particularly for the spring kings. So I always get lots of questions about poisonings and concern that people have. So I want to just remind you that touching mushrooms is okay. You're never going to poison yourself by touching a mushroom. You can't really touch a mushroom and then lick your finger and get poisoned. That's not how it works. So the toxins that are in mushrooms are actually inside the cell walls of those mushrooms. So those cell walls need to be broken down in order for your body to access those toxins. So for example, chewing and eating and digesting a mushroom breaks up those cell walls and introduces those toxins into your system. So one way to avoid accidentally eating something that will make you sick is to go out with experts. I found that focusing on just one mushroom at a time is really helpful for beginners. So, something relatively safe, like a morel that has very few mushrooms that can easily be confused for it. This is in contrast to something like this, the fly agaric that are in the background there. Some people eat those recreationally. I highly recommend against it because they're just full of poisons. You're basically poisoning yourself into a state, and that's not really helpful. Similarly, there's things like amanitas, which are like the deadly death cap fungus. So I avoid that family of mushrooms entirely because I don't even want to get near potential poisonings, particularly because I give my mushrooms away. I don't want to be poisoning my family. And just a reminder that an edible species in one part of the world or one part of the country actually can look very similar to a very poisonous mushroom in a different part of the world. So one of the things we encounter here in California is people from Eastern Europe come here and they think that they can eat certain mushrooms because they look very similar to safe mushrooms back in their the place where they grew up. But when you eat them out here, it causes severe liver toxicity and people die. So, don't eat or cook mushrooms that you are not 100% sure are safe. So I will often say, hey, I'm 95% sure I know what that mushroom is. But that 5% is enough for me to say, you should not eat this mushroom. Don't cook it, don't take it home. I know you really want to have that mushroom, but it's not worth it. And if you're not 100% sure, it's not worth experimenting with your potential life. Just some additional resources. So Sacramento Area Mushroomers, we have some presentations and forays we do every year. We posted up a fall mushroom hunting, or maybe it's like an introduction to mushroom hunting in the region on YouTube. You can find our website, sacramentoareamushroomers.com, and it's linked there. You can also just email me, sacramentomushroomers@gmail.com. Send me photos of the mushrooms that you have questions about. I mean, again, I usually can't do 100% identification remotely, but I can give you a really good idea of what you might be finding. The Mycological Society of San Francisco and San Francisco State University hold a field camp every spring around Memorial Day, where they take people up for the full week and you get to explore with mycologists and really learn a lot. And so I highly recommend this educational week up in the mountains if you're able to afford it and can take the time off. iNaturalist is a website that people post their finds to, and sometimes you can use that as an indicator of when to go out to find certain types of mushrooms. So if you notice a bunch of posts like, hey, we're finding morels, that's probably a good indicator that it's a good time of year to start going out to find them. And it also just helps with citizen science. So that database is now being used by researchers, and so you can help expand the knowledge of fungal diversity here in North America. MycoWeb is another great resource. You can learn about California mushrooms and see a lot of photos. So a lot of the photos from Michael Wood that I had shown, I obtained from MycoWeb. So you go to a specific mushroom, and then at the bottom of the page, after they describe how to find that mushroom or interesting features of it, they'll have a series of links of sometimes like a dozen or 2 dozen photos of that same mushroom. And so you can see how it varies depending on the growing conditions and habitat, and see kind of the diversity of that specific type of mushroom. So that's my presentation, just a couple of pretty mushrooms while we ask questions. Any questions that I can answer? Yes?
What forest, did you say was the forest that had a larger collection capacity?
The El Dorado.
El Dorado.
And then, yeah, I'd say that's probably your best bet, because again, you have that full gallon, gallon bucket,
Yeah.
that's a lot of mushrooms, so.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any experience with, they're doing a lot of the fire prevention, mastication and like that I've seen a lot of it now, and they're even posting, where they're doing it.
Yeah, so what you're looking for is places where they used fire as part of that operation. So sometimes you can go to burn piles in the Sierra. So the Forest Service will do some brush clearing and put it all in one spot and then set it on fire. You'll go to that again after a season of snow has covered that area, and then come back the next spring and see if you can find some mushrooms in that area. So if they've done like a controlled burn, that would probably be the prime area to look for, because it's a wider area, it's a low intensity burn, so most of the trees are still alive. You remember kind of that part of the presentation where I recommended being in areas where there's still living trees, but there's been a fire that's gone through. Those control burns are great for that. So if you know of any really good control burns, they did last fall, and want to email me, we might go out there and check it out, because those are really good habitats.
Yeah.
What happens if you do swallow? What happens if you do eat a toxic mushroom? What should you do to try staying alive?
So, you should immediately call the Poison Control Center. So the Poison Control Centers, you can find the phone number online, and they have professionals that are trained to help you identify what you may have eaten and what the best response is, because there's different responses depending on what type of potential toxin. Maybe they have you throw up, maybe they have you swallow a bunch of charcoal. Usually they'll have you go to the hospital and have a doctor check you out. So it's not pleasant, so don't just go eating stuff, please. All right, wow. Thank you all so much for coming out and giving me your Saturday morning, afternoon. I'll be here for any personal questions you might want to have after, and again, you know how to get in touch if you need.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks everyone for coming to our program. Be sure to join us next month, April 5th at 11 for composting. The UC Master Gardeners will be here. Thank you.
And I really appreciate the county library system has had me out at a couple of libraries, and really appreciate trying to expand the knowledge of mushrooms.